Yes, Steve. Yes, Steve. Only hear you. Something's going on.
Good morning, Wayne. How are you, my friend? Sorry I was on mute. That was a entry-level error.
I think he's going.
We played around with the sound a lot last night, so I think, hopefully, you'll be able to hear me. But I realised I need to sit down and not stride around the room. So I was just recapping, saying, and for some of the people here on the farm, saying we've been encouraged to. Ian also said no questions are out of bounds. So if we want, we can ask dumb questions, stupid questions, or penetrative, thoughtful questions about the farm. And he's really open to learn. And actually, I've got to say, even from day one, when we first came here 11 years ago, they've let us ask all sorts of crazy, maybe dumb questions to, why is that like that? And why is this, and they've always welcomed it. So that's been really fantastic. And it's one of the great things about being here. So getting to know the place, getting to know the people, and getting a feel of what's going on here. Day two is, so we've been invited to observe and interact, to study nature, to use nature as a guide and as a teacher. And I'm going to say is that perhaps the first lesson that nature teaches us when we do look at it is that in every possible way, nature is trying to catch and store energy. That's what's going on. We talked yesterday about the only new energy coming into the system is from the sun. And every plant is trying to create as much surface area as it can to catch and store that energy. James is there as well. Hi, James. So we're just looking at this picture here, and this is, I wanted to introduce you to some of our other colleagues and friends in Sector 39. Deborah did her PDC 6 months ago, in September last year, and she's already in the field teaching. She has about 50 students. And this is her home garden. And just as an icebreaker, throw out a few suggestions. But in what way can we think that Deborah is catching and storing energy in the way that she's arranged her garden there? What's going on? 3D. It's very 3D, isn't it? And why do you think she's done that? She's doubled the depth of the topsoil as well by digging out the path. And she's mulched them very heavily with straw, so that's going to help conserve energy within the beds, sort of drying out in the sun. And also, you'll notice that the troughs between the beds, very deep, and that's to catch rainwater. So when it rains in Uganda, they get a lot of rain very quickly. And if you're not careful, then that could just flood, the surface gets saturated and the water just goes away. So she's using compost, she's using mulch, she's using profile beds, and she's learning all the time. So that in itself, that knowledge and experience that she's gaining is also an energy. She's talking to Stella. The woman in a black t-shirt is Stella Amuge, who I hope will join us at some point. Stella's has a degree at Makerere University in project evaluation. And the lesson I've learned over the years is, access to energy is, capture the output of your work, because that's the evidence that you use for going forward. And what we haven't really been able to do before is to go back 6 months later, 12 months later, and evaluate projects. Say, how did permaculture change your life? Did the PDC, was it useful? You know, what else could we have done to make it better? So there's also a very important part within this about feedback and about being able to accept that feedback and to allow things to develop and to grow. So there's an exchange of energy going on there between those two ladies. And the one who's a sort of pioneering gardener, she's learning fast, she's trying out all these ideas for the first time. And then there's Stella, if you like, sort of capturing the yield of that, the knowledge of that. And that's what the stories that Deborah's telling Stella in that picture is that's what we'll use as evidence of the project outcomes and to try and raise money for future endeavours. So there we go. That's just a little image to get us into the thing, and also just to just to share, introduce you to some of our other colleagues. But I'm going to pause there, and I'd like us to have a chance to do a go round in the room, and I'm going to invite you in turn, come and take the chair, and we're going to give you about a minute, maybe 90 seconds, and you can think about this, and Elizabeth will pre-warn online people, they can think about this as well. We're just going to have a little check-in, and you can just share us your name, help us all remember everybody's names, and tell us where you're from, where you come from. Why are you here? What brought you here? Was there a particular thought? Was there a particular motivation for coming? We'd be interested to know that. And is there anything particular that you hope to get from the PDC? I want to be really good at well anymore. I want to be, I don't know what. Help us with that. I'm very interested in that. And tell us one thing from yesterday that you remember from yesterday. And try and think of something different from what the previous person said. It doesn't have to be if you freeze or be shy, just don't worry, just stop. But we'd love to hear from you. So it's like if I invite you to sit in the chair, then everyone can hear what you're saying. So who feels brave enough? I should take a step. Oh, shall I go first? No. Okay. Somebody. Good. Yeah, just that one.
This one?
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Emily. I'm from here. I work about an hour away from here, and I have my workplace of an artist. What was next, please?
What brought you here?
So I've been working with Ian, who runs the film, and Stephen a bit as well, and I had some funding this year to develop outdoor art practices. So I thought this would fit in really well with that. I started growing sort of herbal medicinal plants.
Something you hope to get from the course?
What do I hope to get from the course? A new way of seeing things, really. You're ready for some new perspectives and to put into starting to grow stuff. Yesterday. The edges, thinking about the edges is what I learned.
Brilliant, thank you.
Now, Steve, just how are we going to do the guys outside of Wales?
They can
They
speak through the through here. They can unmute, yeah.
Just for logistics, should we
Yeah.
do everybody in here?
Yes,
and then
yes,
go?
do everyone
Right.
here first.
Yeah.
Anyone else like to share with us? You can speak to the room as well. Don't worry, don't be too conscious of the microphone, but it's there.
Hi everybody, my name's Kate. I'm about quarter of an hour away south of here. You can actually see the monument, which is Robin's Pillar, and just below that. I don't come from there, I come from Lincolnshire. So Lincolnshire's really dry, and over here is really wet, so there's a lot of difference in the growing. I'm a self-employed gardener, and I garden for a lot of elderly people who think round us is brilliant.
Oh dear.
So the reason I'm here is because I've done a permaculture course before, but I was travelling around, and now I'm settled, and now I've got my customers. I want to really be able to tell them what they're doing wrong, and I really want to be able to just teach them a bit of stuff. So I want to learn more for myself, so I can go out there and teach my customers, and hopefully they'll teach their children and their grandchildren and things like that. I also sell plants, and I specialise in selling plants for pollinators. So that's where I want to go forward. What I learned yesterday, what stuck in my mind, is that life is a chemical reaction. So that is so good. So hopefully, good week. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kay. That was great. And anyone else like to? Here we go.
Yeah, if you can sort of speak about like a thought.
Yes.
How's that?
That's great.
Hello everybody, my name is Molly. I also live quite local, I'm about 5 minutes up the road. I first met permaculture when I wanted to develop my own garden, which I've lived in for 20 years. It was going where I wanted it. So I was a graduate of this course who introduced me to permaculture, and I'm a great believer in synchronicity. And I think recently it was a great turning point in my life. I kind of felt a bit like, I don't even know which one it is. There's that sitting in between where he's going downstairs backwards, being dragged backwards to the body. And he says, do you know there's another way of doing this? Because you stop letting to work it out. And that's exactly how I feel. Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. I retired, hit the big 6-0, months ago, I retired, and this course came up, and I thought, wow, this timing of this is. And the thing that I took home most from yesterday was the overview video. And one of the astronauts mentioning the concept of samadhi, which I think was fascinating, meditative, focusing on one thing and then
Thank you very much, Molly. That was wonderful.
Oh no, we've got Rose saying nothing to hear again.
My name's Owen. I'm from the West Midlands, near Tamworth, which is in farming. I was brought here because I'm interested in permaculture and ecological function and restoration in general. And I went on the Internet Agriculture community on Facebook and asked what the best permaculture courses were, and something that that all the foreground online one by getting online foreground or in person. I hope to get a personal experience in the PDC as well as contacts and networking opportunities. It's nothing really like being there in person, and just like have the same depth of conversation online as you can in person. And one thing from yesterday, I didn't realise just how much like certain niches open up so many more uses in succession is just that much more. I didn't realise just how much it triggered more succession, and that life brings lives more life, and how complexity sort of spirals up into more and more. But that's mentioned it. So yeah,
Joey, right?
Hi, everybody. My name's Claire, and I live about half an hour down the road from here in a town called Shrewsbury. And I've been wanting to do a permaculture course for years and years and years, and actually I've done an introduction too. But I mean, 2 weeks is a long time in permaculture. So, and also, Steve for years and years and years, so obviously there was one permaculture course to it, it was going to be Steve. Yeah, I'm not regretting being here, that's for sure. Probably just wildflowers, really, to be able to just see some wildflowers and to think that I come from I grew up on a farm, but a big arable farm over on the east coast, where we used loads of inputs and bare soil and massive machines and grow daffodils. And just to sort of, and that's all about the middle, and this is all about the edge, and to see the primroses and the cowslips and the other wildflowers on oxlips down in the nature reserve on the edge. And what am I going to do with it? Well, we've got a little allotment, we grow quite a bit of food already, and so sort of improvements there. Because we have got a bit of a plan to take on whole swathes of land on the edge of Shrewsbury and, do this basically. So we'll see what happens. It's not ours. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Cheryl. I'm from, I live in Wrexham, which is about half a mile from here in North Wales, but originally from the Midlands. I've been interested in permaculture for a while. I'm interested in ways in which we can work together with our Mother Earth to tread more lightly on her and sort of protect her as best as we can. I was at a talk that Chris did recently, Steve did recently with EWD Wales, and that really, and I learned about this course. I thought, oh great, so it's the right time to come. What I sort of took away from this is about just how everything really is connected to everything else in the functional relationships.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Very good.
Morning, everybody, especially our African friends and colleagues. Yeah, my name's Tim. I grew up in the Midlands, on the edge of a small town when we moved there, but quite a way inside a small town by the time I moved on, and it's always been with me, that loss of cow fields and outdoor space and the encroachment of concrete isn't necessarily a good thing, I don't think. I trained as an engineer, and I was actually very influenced. Yesterday, Steve showed what we call it, a bit of a perspective from outer space. As I was a student, Friends of the Earth was just forming, and actually one of their most moving posters was simply a photo of the planet Earth from space. And as well as a piece of art, it was pretty helpful, make me think. I've had a lot of luck in my life. I was very privileged to get a place as an engineer at the Centre for Alternative Technology in the very early 80s. In the 80s and the 90s and sort of the early noughties was based around CAT or Mechanical. We did some interesting things there as well with housing co-ops and attempting a bit of rewilding before anybody was doing it except our next door neighbour's garden at home. But yeah, I'm an engineer mostly. I'm most at home with wires and pumps and turbines and calculations and things like that. But I've always had a yearn to get a bit involved in the green side, which was very much going on at Mechanical as well, and something that I was too busy to really do much except join in a bit in cooking or reading or whatever. I'm not a very good reader, to be honest. I'm not very good at distinguishing between things. But I do want to learn, and I'm blessed with my partner, Claire, is as natural a grower as I am a natural engineer. I think that's going on a bit. Yeah. But yeah, I'm here to learn a lot of things. We've got some allotments. We try and grow our own food. We do have a bit of a project on the edge of town to try and bring some more land into permaculture or common ownership or people scale usage or whatever. And I took a lot in yesterday, but the thing I think will stick with me is that jays look after the acorns.
Yes. Great.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie and I'm also here with I work for university in my speech and life. I live locally. Part of why I wanted to do the course is to you, because actually in those circles, I don't really know anyone that is even remotely interested in permaculture. I first came across it about 30 years ago where I pitched that down over the summer on a permaculture farm down there in town with compost and all that stuff. So for me, it's about the network, working together, Shrewsbury, what can we do collectively. I spent a lot of time within the community and dragging my children around the community. And sharing services, and I think because I'm involved with local schools as well, I think it's potentially maybe to do some stuff in there. I'm interested in living, how you can live stuff without people really knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and sorry for not being here.
Rose is saying what can she do? She's got a full network, but no volume.
So, word. Anybody there would like to speak to us? Turn your microphone on or put your hand up to me. Rose is saying she can't hear us, but I think everyone else can.
Yeah, I was battling as well, but the signal seems to come and go.
Is that Wayne? Hi, Wayne.
Yeah, but I think that might be on my side.
Can we encourage anyone else to just to say hello, introduce yourself?
Yeah, I can.
You hear me?
Okay, good, Clovis.
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Who's that? I know what I'll do. I'll give them an order.
This is Stuart, if you can hear me. So struggling with my sound on my as well.
We
Can you hear me, Steve?
No, we can't. Oh. Okay. So maybe we'll.
Hello?
Greeting.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Tell us something. You.
Oh, yes, this is Stuart. Greet. Stuart, I'm from South Africa. I'm in the west side of Johannesburg. I am 39 years old. I have an 18-year-old daughter named Nambulelo. I am a qualified community health worker. So I work with the old guys. You know, I got into farming by chance, and I seem to have fallen in love with it. I've learned a lot. I've met Ali. It taught me a lot about sustainability and continuing farming in a natural and a way that doesn't affect the environment. So I'm here hoping to learn a lot from you guys as well.
Thank you so much, Stuart. You're so welcome, and thank you very much for your
Hey
work.
guys, can you still hear me? Thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right, Rose can understand Stuart, so that's good.
Okay.
Right, so that I've given them an order.
Mm-hmm.
So the next one up should be Clovis.
Come in, Clovis. Are you there? Can you unmute? Or I can do that for you, I think.
Yeah.
We won't spend too long on it. Okay, I'm not hearing you. Okay, guys, look, I think what we'll do is we'll carry on.
But it was James after Clovis.
Okay. So I'll let you.
All right, James. Yeah. Can you go, James?
Yes.
Are you there, Jay?
Hello.
Speaking.
Yes, I'm there. Hello. 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 Can you hear me?
Right, is that
You're.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, Steve, it is my turn. Hey, everyone, this is uh, I'm a trainer, and then I'm Congolese by nationality, and then I've joined Sector 39. Is when we go to be with Steve, and that's in PDC. I've been in different fields.
Okay, I'm going to say thank you for your contributions. We're going to carry on just because that was a bit time consuming. But just very nice to hear some voices and see your faces. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, Steve.
Hey, Clovis. I'm gonna carry on with the lecture now. Okay, so it's
Hello.
yeah. You have to meet him now.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
He's very keen to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think they said we'll carry on now with the lecture. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just trying to get the flavour, and obviously the frustration of technology. Clovis is a refugee from Congo. Eastern Congo is a kind of a nightmare, and there's lots of actually it's intense resource extraction for components of mobile phones. And the companies and the people extracting resources in those areas, they don't go through official things. They go through like kind of warlords and chiefs and stuff, and it's a nightmare. There's a lot of displaced people in from Congo in Uganda, and Clovis is he's a really intelligent guy who's had his education suspended because he's had to be moved around. So he's got into permaculture and permaculture training within the refugee settlements. This is something, an outlet for his sort of creative energies. And he's now teaming up with Sector 39 to be one of our trainers. We're trying to sort of build teams to do peer-to-peer learning. So, yeah, shame not to have him be able to say that clearly, but he's a very, very smart guy. He's also, English would be his third language, so puts us all to shame a little bit. But anyway, great guy. So each day I'm framing around permaculture principle. Today's principle is this one, and it comes with a statement, a saying, and an image. The statement, the number 2, is catch and store energy. And I've already sort of said this, when we look around, that's basically what everything's trying to do. Everything's got to eat. But the saying also, which is kind of interesting, which is we touched on yesterday, make hay while sun shines. And that's telling us that catching and storing energy is timely and strategic. You've got to be there on the right day. And it's not like, oh, we'll make hay on Tuesday. We'll make hay when the moisture content of the grass is right. And so it also reminds us that nature doesn't wait for you. There's a time for action and there's a time for inaction. I always think about the blackberry season. Because when they come, blackberries, stick of blackberries, bloody blackberries, oh, they've gone. Oh, I meant to pick some. You know, it's that timing strategy. Very, very important. The icon is interesting. It's a sun in a bottle. So essentially, we're capturing sunlight. That's our strategy. That's the energy. I say at the core of it. As I've already sort of started to infer, is kind of everything's an energy. Water's an energy. Information's an energy. Compost is an energy. Community, contributions as an energy. How can we capture and store these things? And having a renewable energy technician, engineer in the room it's all about capturing and storing energy, right? And if you think about solar and wind is only second-hand solar power, right? You can say that. And that in order to capture and store energy, you need the right equipment in the right place. You've got to put people say, why do they put wind turbines down the bottom of the valley so you can't see them? That's because the wind's on the top of the hill. You've got to match these things together. It's a plan, it's a strategy. You've got to, and if you're going to invest in equipment, you need the right equipment in the right place. So there's a kind of a thought to that. The first sort of words that David's given us, and this is my summary of his words. So just to say that I've reduced his thought into something more dense. Inappropriate concepts of wealth have led us to ignore opportunities to capture local flows of both renewable and non-renewable forms of energy. So inappropriate sources of wealth: fossil fuels, inflated house prices, things that we think we can rely on, and actually maybe we can't. I think that's our first kind of warning: is we fail to value the things around us because they're often abundant or they just don't seem as significant. So, whereas as we're seeing now, sort of on the farm and other jobs that we're seeing, is going actually out of the way to try and capture and store every single bit of energy that allows you to build productive systems. So I saw that picture of Deborah in her garden there with her swales, with her raised bed, with her mulch, with her compost. That's all part of her strategy, access to energy and build a productive system. Identifying and acting on these opportunities will provide the energy with which we can rebuild capital, as well as provide income for our immediate needs. This is, again, this idea about restoring ecological capital. If we live beyond the carrying capacity of the system, we're depleting the system. So are the strategies that we can put in place actually restore that ecological capital? That, again, is what Deborah is doing in that picture there in her garden. Going out of her way to create uncompacted soils that she's feeding and feeding enormous. That actually is building the potential yield of the whole system. So it seems like the first thing that we do in permaculture, that we observe, we look around and we're looking for opportunities to capture some energy. What am I going to need to take this system forward? So right now you're capturing and storing energy in terms of information, of ideas, of human connections, networking to the farm. All of that helps you build your own ecological capital, or what will help you achieve your next set of goals. Some of the slopes. No, I'm doing the story about. So some of the sources of energy might include sun, wind, and runoff water. Wasted resources from agricultural, industrial and commercial activities. Nature's annual surplus of twigs, grasses and leaves, which can be easily converted via compost into humus. The work that we did in the refugee settlements in northern Uganda in 2018 was, I really had no idea how I was going to connect with these people and what we would, what resources we might have. When we got there, what was really apparent was loads and loads of dry grasses everywhere that people feared might cause a bushfire or something like that, quite realistically. So everybody just routinely burn everything off. If you go in the dry season, the whole landscape's just black. And then you think, well, what are you going to make your compost out of? You've actually just got rid of your primary resource. So again, it's this sort of observing interaction, actually doing an audit. What's there? What can I use? How can I access these resources and combine them in a way in which they then become useful? Paul Agola, after his first PDC, commented in his community they didn't value cow manure because people got cows, stuff's everywhere, cow stinks, get rid of it. Understand it's a resource. That's the shift in the thinking, really. And to make use of that resource, you need a strategy, you need a plan. Okay.
Fail's just
Great. Fail. Yeah. She's not a South African. Yeah. Great. Hi, Faya. Actually, we'll go on to we'll go on to this a bit more. We'll talk about the hedge laying. I'll relate this also to Treflach. Julie was just telling us how they butchered all the hedges down by Llanfyllin, and since you got with chainsaws and just hacked it all down, throw the material off, burn it. That just makes me cry. It really hurts me to see that. What Ian has done here at Treflach Farm is, and you'll see, beautifully laid, woven hedges. That's a Shropshire weave, apparently. And So what Ian has done is let all his hedges grow out, so they're tall, 2 or 3 years, big long wavy sticks. You can see some down the bottom of the hill which haven't been laid yet. So when you lay it, obviously you remove a lot of the material and you know, do the hedging. So that then creates what we call brash, you know, sticks and twigs, big piles of it. What are you going to do with that? It's stuff, isn't it? It's in the way, it's a mess. What Ian's done with it is put it in big piles in the corner of the field, and which instantly becomes wildlife habitat, refuge, invertebrates and insects and things. A year later, Jeremy and I have come along, and we've looked at those big piles of brash, and we've converted them into biochar. What you'll see up in the sheds when we got there this afternoon is we've made tons of it as well. And it could possibly be one of the most valuable outputs of the farm. And we've done that by capturing and storing and valuing the energy of twigs and sticks that other people wouldn't really want to use it for fire, but it's too much processing and there's not enough energy in it. And we'll talk about how we've done that and why we did that later, but that's just a simple example of learning to see the value in the things, which, especially when they're abundant, you then don't value it, like the blackberry thing. Oh,
I've got some ancient woodlands near where I live, and there are lots of non-native trees that grew in some other water recently working now. There's a lot of big plants of trees everywhere.
right.
And people realise they're good habitats for trees, because I heard
Correct.
the water people saying there's some phrases in this book that actually the Germans think like their bombs said they ought to get all these sticks, put them in there, burn them, get rid of them, so it's messy now.
Yeah, you want to get tidy, don't you?
Yeah.
Tidy.
Yeah. I think Victorian garden.
Yeah. So this is part of this sort of shift in thinking that we've got to make, because there is no waste, you know. The lowest value use you can use for any resource is to burn it for energy. That's the lowest value, you know, thing you can do, or just burn it to get rid of it. I mean, that is just criminal. Yeah, so that's part of that thing, and so the most important stockpiles of future value include, this is an interesting one, fertile soil with high humus content, perennial vegetation systems, especially trees that yield food and other resources, bodies of water and tanks, passive solar buildings. This is all ecological capital. He's actually saying, you know, right now, if you were rich, if you were holding lots of cash dollars, you'd probably be thinking, this is, I tried to make predictions, but it seems like we are heading towards an economic shitstorm, because, or an economic transformation, let's say, because the oil industry is going to collapse, and that's going to affect the banking industry, and that's going to affect the US dollar. If you're holding a load of cash, actually, that could lose its value overnight. What would you put it into? Well, we talk about Bitcoin and what's going on in the crypto space. But actually, what's real and tangible is fertile soil, you know, stores of water, and the knowledge to be able to turn that to be able to create income streams, to be able to create unions. That's what's real. Well, that is part of the challenge, but I'm just sort of saying that long-term things, those are the things that actually have real value. The question about how we access those is a secondary point maybe. The proverb, make hay when sun shines, reminds us that catching energy is strategic and time-based. We must make the most of opportunities when they arise. So there we go, there's our principle 2. It's 5 to 10, so we're just going to take a 10-minute break and have a cup of tea. Then we'll start the main lecture at about 5 past, and we're going to go right into sort of the whole sort of bigger, wider thing about catching and storing energy. I'm going to really start by talking about soil, because I think that soil represents the repository of, well, it's last year's energy decomposed, isn't it? It's there, that's what's there, and I think that's again the beginning of our journey into this, and we've realised that's really what's real. That's the thing that we can work with and take value from. So yeah, I shall take a pause and Okay, yeah, so we're running through components of soil. We've looked at soil horizons, looked at changes in characteristics as we go deeper down to the ground. We talked about different climate zones, and now we're just thinking about the components the soil is made out of. It's interesting now to think of what proportion of the soil is minerals and what other things might be made out of. If we have a recipe, like a cake recipe or something for making soil, what would we be putting in our recipe? We've got mineral particles, decaying matter, so bits of twigs and sticks and dead worms and bird droppings. Okay, so we've got that. What else? Bacteria, this living things, isn't it? What we might call soil biota, the living component of the soil. Yeah. Fungi, yeah, again, very important part of the soil biota. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, water. And the two more things. Well, yeah, gases, especially air. Yeah. And there's one other thing that I mentioned before, said again. The other component is humus. Your dead organic matter is dead organic matter, that's not humus. Humus is the other end of that decomposition process. But the humus is the sticky black stuff that sticks it all together. Okay. So, go back to our mineral particles. This is out of Bill Mollison's the designer's manual. So a fine clay is less than 0.002 millimeters in diameter. Clay particles are 0.002 in diameter, so very, very small. Millimeters, yeah. And silt up to 0.2, and sand up to 2 mil across. That's coarse. And then gravels, cobblestones, and boulders. It's nice to know that there's a definition of the difference between a stone, cobble, and a boulder. You will not be tested on this later. But it's just good to know, and it's getting a sense of the soil and empathy for it. So, we say we've got 4 different types of soil. Maybe this is in a temperate context, but in the soils that we're working with in our gardens, on types of areas, characteristics of a sandy soil, if you think about it, because it's got large particles, and there'll be lots of air spaces in it, sandy soil is very free draining. And free draining soils are fantastic. Plants like free draining soil. They can get their roots, can work their way down in there very easily. They're chasing after the water, so we've got deep roots in plants. They've been stimulated by that. And very few plants, unless they're specialist plants, like to sit in wet ground. So sandy soil also have a lot of air in it. It's got a lot of positives. What might be the negatives? They dry out really quickly. So when you're working with sandy soil, you need to work in a lot of humus and compost. You need to mulch. Sandy soils tend to be slightly alkaline. So you're advised to check the soil pH every few years. A clay soil, heavy, what you said, heavy, and that's because it's heavy, sticky, wet, hard to break up, and when dry, it can almost become like brick. So you're advised to use grit, well-rotted manure to help break it up. But clay soils hold nutrients. Clay soils are rich in nutrients, and you actually look at the patterns of Roman settlement, and when they came into Britain and they were looking for the best places to grow, they looked at the clay areas, because that's where if you like, the stored nutrient was. So you can, there are some easy gains to be had. So all around like Hereford, all of that, fruit growing areas down there, that's all very heavy clay soils, but it's full of nutrients. But you've got challenges from it. So silt, generally a good structure, can become water when wet, or dust-like when dry. Well, the dust-like and dry, that's Lincolnshire, isn't it? The soils are blown away. improved by regular additions of organic matter and well-rotted manure. Keep well mulched in summer and when being left fallow. Usually has a neutral to acid pH. Vegetables like to grow, so the pH scales from 0 to 14, 7 is neutral. Vegetables like 5, 6 and 7. Potatoes like 5, most veg like 6 or 7, close to neutral. Brassicas, cabbage family, like that, that's what we alkaline, 8. Just out of interest. So what's a loam? Got sandy, silt, clay. Loam is all nicely, beautifully mixed together with lots of humus, and that's what we want to get to. And what's interesting is no matter what soil type you're working with, if you don't compact it, so clay soils never stand on a clay soil. The compaction will be there. We did a very interesting soil experiment in Permaculture a few years ago. What we did was we teamed up with the workhouse, which is an old poorhouse in the 19th century, and they built the poorhouse on floodplain of the river Clyde, and also at the bottom where all the cold air sits below the village, in the frost pockets. Put the poor people down on the floodplain in the frost pocket. And what we did was it became a community project, and we had a series of festivals there, like summer, multi-stage, dancing, crazy music, kind of like festivals. And this was the soil experiment. So we had 5,000 people. We put them on a very heavy clay soil field. And then we asked them to jump up and down to regular beat music. And then we allowed it to rain very heavily. A really fantastic result. Because what happened was everyone jumped up down on the grass, and the grass compacts and goes down, and the clay squirts out like a sort of, I don't know, squirt. And then you get a layer of clay sitting on top of your soil. Then when you finish a festival, you go away, it dries out. It stays like that. And for a whole year, you couldn't stand on the field because you absolutely destroyed the soil structure by having a festival on a heavy clay field with a heavy rainfall. And it's almost become almost impossible to do those kind of events down there now because we realise that the soil just can't take it. And you have to come up with all sorts of other strategies to reduce impact on all of that football. Some of the places where there were stages and people had really danced, months and months later, this was an interesting thing. I ran a PDC there, and I made everybody take their shoes and socks off and walk around on the grass where the festival is. And you can feel the worm casts under your feet. When you get to the areas where the stages have been and everybody just took it down, nothing, just dead, because all of the oxygen being pushed down. So, interesting experiment, lots of learning, trying to do that way. Yeah.
I don't know what that's playing. What I was thinking, but like the field being basically filled.
Do you know what puddling is? Like if you that's puddling. So if you have some soil and you do that to it, what happens is the big particles are pushed down to the bottom and the small particles rise to the top. So then it seals and you have a water impermeable barrier. So you can make ponds like that. That's how they made the canals. You had lots of clay and you had Irish people jump up and down on it and doing that. And then that sealed the canals. Puddling. So when you compact your soil, that's what you're doing. Really, and it can take years for it to resolve because if you push out the oxygen, the microbes can't be there, can't do the work.
When you ship them and they do ship around,
right.
All the big ones.
The small ones at the top.
Yeah, all the percentage at the bottom.
Right, and
they're the biggest ones.
with peanuts at the top.
Yeah, and the little ones at the top.
So understand the impact that we're having on these things. It's a complex living system, so all of these things. It can be useful to know that if you want to track water from the system. There's a fantastic, I have great videos, there's a book there. One of the most successful permaculture farms in the world is in Austria, and it's managed by a guy called Sepp Holzer. And even though he's high up in the mountains, he's gone out of his way to trap as much water as he can in the landscape. And he does that with a digger, and just by digging a hole, and then he literally throws the spoil that he's dug out up into the air with the bucket of the digger, and lets it all fall down. So the heavier ones hits down first, and the smaller particles land after. So and then he hits it with the bucket of the thing, of the digger, and forms a lake, forms a pond.
Does his surname have a T in it?
Holzer. Sepp Holzer. His kids are now taking over Next Generation. There's a farm called Permaculture in Austria, the Austrian Tyrol. And it's high up in the mountains, and it's extraordinary what it's going to do by creating lots of microclimate. So he uses the water, catches to energy, but also as the water becomes a thermal store, and also water is reflective, so it can bounce sunlight off the surface of the water onto cliffs and rocks and boulders. He also always surrounds his water with large boulders, because again they store energy in terms of thermal heat store. Anyway, I digress slightly, but you might want to do the jam jar test. And probably everyone's done this in primary school or something, but it's actually a very interesting and revealing thing to do. And to really understand your jam jar test, you need to compare it to other ones so you can see the differences. But essentially, you take still under the surface, just under the roots, say, and take a handful of soil, fill your jam jar about a third full of soil, fill the jam jar almost to the top with water, and give it a really, really good shape. Really, really good shape. So everything is swirling around inside, and set it down on a level surface. And coarse sands and gravel, the large particles, will deposit out immediately, and you'll see that happening very quickly. And then you'll have the finer sands and maybe silt will settle out, and you'll see it sediment, you'll see the layers in the jar. Now, if you've got a lot of clay in your soil, the water will stay muddy. It will just look muddy, and it might stay up for 2 or 3 days. And that's the difference between clay and sand and silt particles, is that clay is remaining in suspension in the water. So wherever you're looking for clay in the landscape, it's generally at the bottom because it washes through. So if you dig down deep at the bottom of the valley, you'll come to clay. Or often, which again is why the floodplain, where the workhouse is, the floodplain at the time is very high clay soil. Because those small particles, obviously, the action of water, gravity, wash through. So you can get a sense, get a feel for what your soil might be like just by doing this sort of comparative test. And you might find that the organic matter might either sit on the top of finding when the clay does set. I've had some that have taken days to clean up. But then even then there might be some organic matter that floats around in there as well that might sit on top of the clay. It's a very simple way to get a sense of the proportions that you might have in the soil that you're working with. Yes.
How is learning to maintain natural?
Well, yeah, well, it's the interaction of all of the soil life that combines it all together, actually. So imagine that the soil particles constantly passing through the gut of a worm and being aggregated together, and the more movement there is in the soil, then the particles get mixed together, which is what we want, really well mixed. So you'll see this diagram in many.
Can I just say, Stuart has commented, he says we've actually done the jar experiment and we've got some interesting results.
Okay. Thank you, Stuart. Okay, there you go. So there's my little, there's my little diagram to kind of help visualise that process of even your fine clay soil might get aggregated together to create this fund structure. If it's kind of stuck together in sort of biological glue, that is the result of it passing through the gut of worms and other interacting with other creatures, other species. So let's just go down into the soil now and think more closely about the associations and relationships that are going on within it. And this is kind of interesting. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is it's wrong to think of roots sort of smashing their way, barging their way down through the soil, sort of opening it all up. Roots are very delicate, and if they're in a hard, compacted soil, roots are struggling to get down, they might get damaged, and the surface might be, abrasion, and which allows them perhaps disease and other potential weaknesses. So again, you don't want to grow in compacted soil. That's what you need very specialist plants, in the soil. There is a wonderful, wonderful plant that grows brilliantly in compacted soil, which we could chat about as well. This is an idea, because some do favour those conditions. So you can imagine where you keep your stock with animals like horses, let's say, or cattle. You might put them in a kraal or a paddock. A paddock, the animal, the place where the animal can grow there. So in a paddock, animals poach the ground and they're standing around a lot. So what's the plant that germinates in the paddock? Stock plant. Very, very common plant here. It's generally regarded as weed. There's a massive deep taproot which goes deep down into the subsoil. As that plant lives and dies, it opens up channels going deep down to the soil, so air and water can percolate, and slowly unimpact the soil. Well, it's it's super compacted. What they're doing is uncompacting the soil. All I do is just chop the tops off, let them regrow and keep chopping the tops off, and eventually they'll do that to accelerate the process. Somebody told me, I never tested how it's exactly true, but that the dock seeds can lie dormant in the soil for 80 years. So when people say, oh, cut that dock down, the seeds and go everywhere, it's like, no, the seeds are there already. They're just waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Again, thinking about the role of so-called weeds, they're triggered by certain sets of conditions. But most plants, as I'm saying, most plants actually don't want to be pouring down through compacted soils. And instead what they're doing is they're weaving their way through the little gaps and fissures, and as they grow and swell, sort of opening that soil up. That's a better way of thinking of it. So here we've got the root of the plant. We can see the little root hairs going off at the edges, off to the side. So just for a moment to think about the difference of the root with the root hairs going off it, which is also very, very sensitive. Think about how that multiplies the edge effect of the plant. Think about how that expands the surface area that is in contact with the soil. And that's where all of the important nutrient exchanges are going on. Between the surface of the plant and the surrounding soils. Now, also, if we look into this picture, we can see part of the soil is flooded, is wet, so the water there. Also, we're seeing the very interesting thing is what they call a micropore. Think about those little cavities and spaces between the soil particles. Now, it turns out that this is where the magic happens. It's not so much the soil, the mineral particles, the same thing, it's the gaps in between, because that's where the air is. And that's where a lot of the biology then is happening. That's where complex organic molecules are being broken down into much simpler components, which ultimately can be taken up by the plant. And all of that is happening in the action of microbes and soil microbes. And that happens in these little air spaces. So, keeping your soil covered, keeping it moist, and not compacting it, all of that is favouring the soil biota. And in organic gardening, organic growing, organic farming, what we're trying to do is grow soil. And if we grow soil, healthy soil, the plants and soil sounds like. Plants in healthy soil don't get disease. It's only when they're stressed and become vulnerable. And these are things we want to explore much more deeply without some growing experiments here, to understand these processes more deeply. But that's essentially what we're trying to do. So let's say, what's the difference between organic and inorganic? And the answer is in organic growing, we're growing soil, and in non-organic growing with plants. Our focus is on the soil. That's the point. So this little diagram, I like it because it's just giving us a sense now of this complex environment and the microclimates and the habitats that might exist within. It's an enormous surface area and complexity that's within the soil. So, here's a slide. Now, Jeremy he's got a microscope. Yeah, we've got it here yet, not that. At the next day, we get a chance to look into it and look at some soil and see what's going on in it. Here's a nice slide. So these are our mineral particles. This is pretty much the same as what we were looking at in the previous slide. Pretty much what we were looking at there. This is what we're drawing. So here's our mineral particles. But look how these mineral particles are knitted together by the clay organic matter complex. So these ideas of mineral particles, very small clay particles, knitted together by humus. Here's a fungal hyphae here. So fungi have these tiny little tubes, one cell thick, creates an enormous amount of surface area, and that hyphae or mycelium is also binding the soil together and knitting it together. I'm going to give you a mind-blowing statistic. This is from the Stamets, in my college. This guy, if you took it out on YouTube, he's got some very interesting things to say. It's called Mycelium Running, and Paul Stamets. He's one of the leading mycologists in the world, I would say. And he got into it by starting off being a hippie and taking magic mushrooms. And apparently had an appalling stutter. He was paralysed almost by a stutter. And his youth, he climbed a tree and having ingested a large amount of psilocybin, and a massive lightning storm came across. He had such an amazing experience, he lost his stutter. And it made him want to understand the world of fungi. So the fact that the fungi inspired him in the very beginning is an interesting thought to me. And then when we realised, and when we saw the biological tree of life, that the thing most closely related to animals is fungi, we're not so different. And maybe it's not so remarkable that there's a kind of biochemical relationship. Yeah. So, the mothering mycelium. So Stamets says this: in a cubic inch of healthy topsoil, 3 centimetres, cubic inch of healthy topsoil, there might be 8 miles of mycelium.
Just say that again.
8 miles of mycelium in a cubic inch of topsoil. Yeah. Yeah. Who measured that? I don't know. I haven't seen the workings out. Yes. I've got some pictures of mycelium, and when you start looking into it, you go, yeah, I get it now. I understand what that means. It's an enormous amount of surface area. So think about the effort that fungi has gone to construct that matrix, and then think what you might be doing with your fly. And not only that, again, Stamets talks about this again, is within that mycelium, it creates little pockets, little sort of micropores in the previous slide. And then that mycelial mass, think of the little pockets and little habitats and habitats within that might just totally suit a colony of yeast, or a colony of bacteria. So it's almost the mycelium again creates the habitat that these microbes can live in. So here we've got a beetle chasing after an amoeba. We can see we've got another fungi, mycorrhizal hyphae here. And this is a root. Okay, sorry, I'm seeing it's harder to see. Yeah, this is a root here, and there's a root hair, and this is describing now mycorrhizal fungi. So this is a fungi that has grown into the root of the tree, of the plant. And what's happening is it's a two-way thing happening there, very well described by Lady Eve in her book. The plant is digesting the fungi as it grows in, eating the hyphae. And at the same time, the hyphae is channeling sugars from the plant into the mushroom. We've got a total, a nutrient exchange happening there. It's very sort of intimate level. We can see nematodes, we can see more amoebas, all sorts of other crazy things that we're maybe not familiar with because we haven't gone down to the. So all of this is, you don't need to know, remember this, what you do need to know to get this empathy for this soil biota. That's what we're interested in, that's what we're working with. So I think this is one of Lady Eve's pictures actually, and she was very interested in this little pine seedling. And what you're seeing there is the brown, the orangey brown, those are the roots of the pine seedling. The white, that's the mycelium, that's the fungal mycelium. When we say we call mycorrhizal fungi, rhizo means roots. The rhizosphere means the root zone. So mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that have this very specific relationship with plants. Now I said yesterday that plants, life on Earth originated in water, and plants originally were like algae, unicellular things bobbing around and didn't have roots. And that Stamets reckons that maybe this fungi was the first thing to live on land, but then plants learned how to team with that fungi so they could also live on land. And I think that this is the mycorrhizal fungi almost predates roots. And now I even started to wonder whether the roots of a plant are more about creating surface area to interact with mycelium than it's about interacting with the soil itself. That's interesting to really think about that. And what you can see here as well is you see lots of little white dots along the roots. You can see those. So those are fungal nodes. So the fungi starts from a single point and then sends hyphae out in all sorts of different directions. Wherever it finds something interesting, it starts dividing and creating more surface area. It's not interested in it, it just carries on. So these nodes, so you then create a distributed system of which there's no individual center, but there's multiple different separate nodes. That's going to come up in patterns next week. It's going to be patterns of resilience. Anyway, so yeah, fascinating picture. And again, just looking into that now, you start to get a sense of as it's branching and branching and branching, this is where the 8 miles come from. The enormous amount of that can be done. So a part of a mycorrhizal fungal association like this is expanding the surface area of its root zone by hundreds of times. So it's a massively significant difference. And what was it Jeremy was reading, I think we were talking about it the other day, is the particular. Hi. That's okay. We got a message from you that you were. Oh, the farm did, I think. Janet, yeah? Yes. Good. Welcome.
You've got a seat down here, or if you want to go in front.
Yes.
Yeah,
Sit. How would you come from quite a way today? Okay.
Welcome.
Yeah. So we're on day 2, and this is an introductory stuff in there. If you haven't for that. Permaculture began with this book, Janet, long time ago. 78, first published in 78. And it's a joint publication between Dr. Bill Morrison, who was a professor at Hobart University at the time, and one of the students, David Holmes. Bill went on to write this massive book, which is the sort of permaculture text. It's quite hard to approach it, it's so dense with words and ideas. So this is actually genius, but hard to read. David simplified it all. He thought about a different way, perhaps, to get across his ideas, and he reduced permaculture into the formula of 3 ethics, 12 principles, and a set of design tools. So, right, and those principles are sequential. It takes you through a process which reaches from observing nature to think about how you design with nature. So we're following that pattern for our course. Principle 1 is observe and interact. We spent yesterday observing and interacting, getting to know each other, getting to know the farm, getting to know whatever, what it's all about. And also the invitation to let nature be your teacher. If we're interested in long-term sustainability of generation, the only model we can learn from is nature. 4 billion years evolution, hard to argue with that. So when we observe nature, what we see, principle 2, is capture the surroundings. Nature is doing everything it can to try and hold on to useful things. And that's what we're talking about today. And we're talking about soil, and at the moment we're just talking about soil fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, things that form associations with plant roots. We can do a pine seedling. And the white is the fungus, is mycorrhizal fungi, and the yellow is the roots of the plant. Many, many hundreds of times more surface area by this beneficial association. Essentially, in permaculture, we're interested in beneficial associations. That's what it's all about. And that's what you see nature seems to be typified by that. So those white dots. That's what the mycorrhizal fungi looks like. It looks like something alien. And those are the hyphae stretching out into little one-cell thick tubes. Again, just not to imagine the surface area like that and realise that those tubes are covered also in bacteria and things like that that are also trying to eat the fungus. Really complex. All this is like a little tube. So this is the heart of a beast, if you like. Here we go, a fungal spore germinating, and it's going, I want to eat. I'm going to send a tube that way. If I find something that looks or feels like food, I'm going to start subdividing and creating more surface area. So fungi do something which is called extracellular digestion. They digest their food outside of their body. So they exude enzymes. So if I'm a fungi and I come into there's something interesting, my stomach acids, if you like, my enzymes are going to digest something, it weeps them out into the surrounding soil, digest that obviously breaks down the substrate that's interested in eating, and then it reabsorbs it back into the tube. And when it's run out, it goes off again, looking for the next thing. And we could go, I'm not going to go too far into the whole fungi thing because there's so much to say about it. But one of the things is you can set a fungi to grow from your maize, it will explore every option from maize, then it will work out the quickest route across it and then focus its resources into that. So we can actually use them to solve complex problems. Stamets are convinced that fungi are intelligent and that the patterns that they create represent information. And it might be a language that we Western that the primary habitat thing, if fungi are the first things to live on land, understand that they then created the conditions that the succession could then move on to. So again, Stamets would argue that it's the greatest tool to partner with in terms of restoring damaged habitats mediating damage lands, also toxic lands. We'll get onto it later, but so that's what fun about IPF. That is correct, yes. Just imagine your London tube map and you put all the stations on it and you plate that into a little maze and you put the pond down in the middle and it works out the best way to link them all together. But you can try every option and then we'll optimize it. So it's intelligent. I mean, that's intelligence, right? In some form. It's like the way I showed you yesterday, the picture of the birch seeds, just zillions of them covering the ground. So that's sort of how the mycelium works. It covers every base, it explores every option. But when it finds the one that works, it focuses on that. I actually don't know. Trial and error. It actually is. It actually is. And again, the standards is kind of sophisticated. Remember also, they've been around for hundreds of millions of years longer than we have in the evolutionary timeline. Yes.
So and then it's more
yes, it could focus on the one that is the most, which is the straightest line or most effective distance. Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. Okay, so
22.
so we were ready for tea in 8 minutes. Great. So I think we can get a bit into the soil food there. On that. So this. Just struggling for a second. Okay. So let's explore some of the relationships going on within that in the soil, again, in a slightly more simplified way. I also want to bring into the conversation the concept of trophic lands. Trophic means referring to energy. And so in any living system, the only new energy coming in is from the sun. Only plants can translate that energy into a stored form of, into carbohydrates or sugars. Only plants can do that. If the energy coming into the system is feeding the plants, the biomass of the plants is going to be the largest component of any system in terms of its dry weight, biomass. Living matter and dead matter. That's the first trophic level. So if you make your business, Janet, by eating that grass, then on an energy level, that you're never going to be able to eat that grass to 100% efficiency. So there's going to be less biomass of you than the grass that you're eating, because there's going to be an energy loss in the transfer between the first and second trophic level. Okay? So in the soil food web, there are those organisms that live actually in direct association with plant roots, and also things that are decomposers, mutualists, pathogens, parasites, and root feeders. So those things that live closest to the plant, that's going to be the thing that's the second most abundant in terms of dry weight biomass within the system. And that's the bacteria, fungi, nematodes, that kind of food. And that's translating the energy of the plants, if you like, along the food chain. So our third trophic level are the things that eat the things that are on the second trophic level. And of course, some might eat directly at the primary level as well. It's always going to be a bit more complicated. The third trophic level, we've got shredders, predators, and grazers. So you might have small arthropods, small insects that like to eat nematodes and fungi. You might have big nematodes that like to eat little nematodes or that eat bacteria. And also these things called protozoa, which include amoeba, flagellates, and coelacanths. Those little gooey things we saw in the slide in the previous picture, they're feeding off the detritus field created by bacteria and fungi behind them. And only when we get to the fourth trophic level are we then beginning to see things which are visible and bigger, larger worms, predator nematodes, bigger insects, and things that, again, on fifth and higher trophic levels, birds and mammals would be feeding. And then, so it's always going to create that pyramid of some kind. You're going to have an energy pyramid because there's energy loss between trophic levels. You're never going to have 100% efficiency digesting food and what have you. And you wouldn't want to because that's what feeds the next, feeds the system, if you like.
And some of us can lower this up and turn the layers down, so we theoretically the next place to do one but also
Yes, that's right. So the higher up, the more options. So here's the thing: if you decided to only eat golden eagles, you would massively reduce your opportunities to feed because there's only one pair per however many square miles. I think it takes 70 hectares of rainfall to support one pair of jaguars. So you need a big farm if you were mainly going to eat jaguars. But the jaguar perhaps going to eat at different layers and also on that pyramid. It's interesting to do that. So there's an efficiency there to lower down, maybe not eat so many golden eagles and eat more oat porridge, like Elizabeth did this morning.
Yeah, very nice too.
Almost down at a primary level. So we have choice. Sorry? Yeah, splashing myself on the golden eagles. Okay, so this isn't hard to see, but it's worth looking into. So each one of these pie charts, let's look at the one at the top. It's a pie chart of the total volume components of the average soil. So we're going to have a percentage, aren't we? So of the average soil, according to Bill Morrison in this book, by volume, in a healthy soil, 12 to 15% is the bits that are alive, soil biota, the thing that we just looked at in that food web. That's a lot. 15% is the gooey things, the protozoas and the worms and the what have you. Interestingly, so we always think about soil and we're very aware of its mineral base, we talk about sands, silts and clays, but actually only 30% by volume of a healthy soil is those minerals. And humus and roots maybe account for 12%. We allow 10 or 11% of soil water. What we're getting here is the pore spaces, gases and gels is 40%. And in fact, if we go to the pie chart below, which is composition of garden loam with mulch and rich soil biota. So this is what we would be making in Claire's garden. Arranged proportions from wet peats. Okay, so take some averages. But basically, if we're looking at this one here, this fascinates me, is so your uncompacted, not stood on it, you kept it mulched, you kept it nice and moist, you've got lots of soil biota going on within it. 30% organic content, 10% minerals, 10% water, 50% air. So think of soil like a cake or a soup layer. And that's something that I really thought about when I say when we're walking around barefoot on the workhouse field after we acted by the festival, you could feel the action of the worms almost starting to lift the soil up like a souffle rising. Because what they're doing is they're tunneling up through it, making the worm pass on the surface and go down, so they make it into like a cheese or something. And so my final thought before we go into tea, I do believe I have 60 seconds. We talked about edges yesterday, right? So what's the edges is the most productive and interesting part of any system. So here's for me, it's such an interesting edge. One side of the edge is the sky, other side of the edge is the ground, the rocks. The soil is half of it. A healthy topsoil, half minerals and gilly things are there. That's such an interesting edge, and that's where the solar energy coming in is translated into storeable forms of carbon. Trees, sugars, carbohydrates, turnips, bunny rabbits, all those things. That's all happening there. Actual store energy into that soil. Soil is so important, and don't stand on it to recover. That's your take home. Is that you don't have to remember the names of all the gilly things, but you need to know that they're there. And if you look down Jeremy's telescope, not microscope, later when it comes, you get seen to. So great.
Can we, Clovis is wanting to participate.
Yes.
Can we just hear what he's saying?
Please.
So you're just saying the mycorrhiza increase the uptake of water and nutrients, especially phosphorus. Hang on. Particularly important in degraded or less fertile soils.
Very true.
And we get to the end of the message. Yeah, roots colonized by the mycorrhiza are less likely to be penetrated by root-feeding nematodes.
Right. Oh.
Since the pest cannot pierce the fungal network.
Maybe what the plant contribution brought out one that was what NDA realized about
you can buy inoculants, you can, and I think especially if you're establishing, really important, maybe expensive shrubs and plants, is a really important thing. And I think maybe it was Grace who was telling me, my friend Grace, was saying how certain parts of the plant's life cycle where they're very ready to form mycorrhizal associations. This is when you're planting on pots of plant that just germinated, then you get that difference in which being inoculated, and that will guarantee a much better result. A lot of nurseries decide to use it for, plants that cost like 40 quid a pot or whatever. Definitely, yeah. Good points, Clovis, thank you for that. And yeah, so important. Okay, we're going to take a 30-minute break and we'll be back at midday. So we'll see you then. Anyone, or do feel welcome to chat. Yeah, okay, so we're talking about the availability of nutrients and plant soil types within our landscape. So the next thing I just want you to consider is, because it's a very typical shape that we're looking at here, is this cross-section of this valley. And what we notice is at the bottom, we've got a very shallow slope, and as we move up the hillside, we have convex slope moving to a concave. You see that, how that bulges out, the steeper slope, and there's a very important point about here, which is like the sweet spot of the hillside. And I'll bring this out, make this point later on as well. So as you can see, also think about how the soil types might change as you move down the valley side. And understand that the best bits to farm are from the middle points to the lower point, is this section here. Because it's going to be free draining, but there's a constant flow of water coming from above. You might have issues and springs coming out here as well. But also is, as much as water moves down here, so does cold air. Cold air is heavier than warm air. So you might get frost pockets at the bottom. This is where the workhouse is, down at the bottom of the frost pocket. And this is where the village of Permaculture is higher up. We're not sat in the frost pocket. And so this becomes very good farming land on this area here. You can have your intensive pastures down on the bottom, but they're going to flood in the winter. So you might really get a good spring cut of hay or something off the bottom. So it's very interesting to think about where you are in the landscape and how that informs the characteristics of the soil that forms there. I'm not going to too much detail because it gets but it's another thing that I just wanted to keep in mind. This is the big picture of the carbon cycle, the overall picture. So let's just exclude the thing on the left. Let's just look at the trees in the middle. Let's just consider this. These numbers are from 1990, so a little bit out of date. And these are billions of tons. So here's an important point to understand. So we talked about planting trees to fight climate change, thinking about that. A mature standing forest is almost carbon neutral. It represents a big store of carbon, but the trees have already grown. They've done most of their carbon sequestration already. And you can see if we have a global figure, standing forests draw down 450 billion tons of carbon a year, but they return 444. So there's a net sequestration of about 6 billion tons of carbon from existing standing forests. And that's because as much as the trees are growing, so are they dying. So are they shedding their leaves and being eaten by caterpillars and so forth. So where does that carbon go? It gets translocated into the soils, and that's what builds long-term soil fertility and carbon sequestration. That's something that we're very, very interested in. The same thing happens over the sea. We've got some algae and the whole food chain, obviously complex food web within the oceans. And simplistically, think of all those little shellfish and what have you with their calcium carbonate structures, shells and everything. That represents, as they live and die and that sediments out, that represents also carbon, sequestration of carbon. And there's a net sequestration of about 6 billion tons over the oceans as well. So that's nature helping stabilise the system. Now that's how, imagine that's how we've had a slow net stacking away of carbon going on for millions and millions of years. Along comes Homo sapiens, and we start burning fossil fuels. So we've got a net sequestration of 12 gigatons, but figures from 1990, we're pumping 23 gigatons into the atmosphere. Let me tell you, in 2021, it is now 40 gigatons. We've had the single biggest rise in carbon emissions in a year this year. And when we went back a bit last year to go more in the tidal away, we've now set it in the final. This is not, anyway, this is the bigger picture. So not only that is, we keep expanding the emissions 23 gigatons to 40 gigatons, but we're eroding into the forest cover. And we're releasing that carbon, and we're reducing that ability to carbon sequestration. The other thing that's happening in the oceans is the more dissolved carbon that is in the water, that water then becomes more acidic. And if you're a shellfish with a calcium carbonate exoskeleton, acidity is not a good thing. It means you do well. And that's what happened to the coral reefs and what happened. And so the ability of the living system to absorb this surface carbon is being diminished. So this again, I'm telling the big picture, that's how it fits into the whole climate emergency thing. Now, it's a time to think about water, and I think it's very hard to think about soil without thinking about water, because the two things interact with each other so much, so closely. And also is water is the other sort of very important energy that we're looking to capture storage. So let's just think about this a little bit, just understand the bigger picture again. Is the land tends to heat up and cool down in the sun faster than the water in the ocean. The oceans are huge, big thermal mass. It takes a long time to heat up, and a long time to cool down. During the day, the land heats up quite quickly, and then in the evening, it cools down quite quickly. So what that does is that creates thermal currents between the sea and the land. So during half of the day, it's going one way, and the other half of the day, it's going the other way. Sun's rising on the sea, water vapor is evaporating, warm air rises, that's one of our universal qualities, warm air rising off the sea. As it rises, so does it cool, it gets colder up there. That water vapor starts to coagulate into the drops and you get clouds. So when the winds are moving over the landscape, those clouds then start to also travel over the landscape. As you move away from the seashore, the land rises, the clouds rise, they cool down, the water droplets aggregate even more, and you start getting rain. Imagine that rain is going to land over the whole landscape. Everything's going to get soaked. And firstly, the delegated matter on the surface of the soil will absorb and hold that water. That's why we use mulches, is because we want to hold water as high in the landscape as we can. If you've got surface covering on your garden, you're holding the water above where the plants are. So that's going to be good, isn't it? Some of that water is also going to find its way, it's going to hit impermeable barriers and it'll start going downhill. You can hit that accurately. But also you can see the water's taking other routes through. Some of it will go very deep down and become soil water, and it might stay there for months or even years. It'll take a very long journey back. Others might find its way into streams and rivers and return to the oceans quite quickly. There's different routes and there's different speeds. And you can also see that there's a lot of evaporation going on the land and the way water is then being returned again back to the atmosphere. So let's explore that. We've all seen this picture before, again, it's kind of primary school stuff, but it's good to be reminded that even in the hydrological cycle, everything's connected to everything else. Rain is not an individual event, but a separate event happens by a chain reaction.
You say carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
Then carbon is represented by molecules from things like that, or is there like actual material really interesting?
No, they need humus, they need dead bits of stick.
What's humus?
Well, it's an emulsion. It's the breakdown product of. You start with a bit of tree, which is a mixture of carbon and nitrogen and other things. But if you like, the basic structure of it is the carbon. And as that breaks down, it's just carbon in another form. Now we're talking about mycorrhizal fungi a lot. We think about those fungal hyphae. Those little tubes have a very hard and durable form of carbon within them. That's what the actual fungi is constructed out of. So when we have fungally dominated soils, actually those hypha represent again carbon-rich soil. And then those molecules are available for the fungi to reprocess and take more carbon. Good question. I don't know. Yes. Yes, because it's not mobile, is it?
I think it's organic chemistry.
Yes. That's active and moving around. Yeah.
Which is building
Of everything else. Yeah. Yes, I mean, it's best to think of the fertility of soil as the microbes in both the living and dead state, rather than, we've all seen like these mineral fertilizers, salt soluble things. The fertility looks like that. It's the wrong way to think about it.
Yeah. The carbon itself is
which has been actively being exchanged. So that's another way to touch on the biochar thing. It's another way to think about it is, so what's a coral reef? Coral is the most abundant, diverse habitats in the oceans, the coral reef. They're made out of what? Yeah. That's it. So basically, you've got this calcium carbonate structure that actually is contributing nothing to the aquatic environment other than edge and surface area and places for little bits to stick and little places for fish to hide and lay their eggs. So in some ways, that reef structure is like, that's a block of flats. So you think about the biochar as like a block of flats within the soil, creating a habitat for all of those other exchanges and like this. Yeah, so it's actually not well understood what it is, except you'll know when you've got that sticky black. Yeah. That soil has a lovely aroma, by the way. I put this out to Stephanie's garden. Look at its crop structure, look how it's not, you know, Jeff was trying to pick up that stuff underneath the sugar cane, and it was like, you couldn't even get it, it was like all, you know, lost its structure. So that's what I mean by crumb structure. Think about that's 50% air. Yeah. Right, yes.
Steve, question from Clovis. It
Yeah.
says, is the water cycle over the picture?
Is it? Yeah. So if you imagine, I mean,
you can see picture of the water.
Yeah. You can imagine that this is like a constant conveyor belt of warm air rising and moving over the landscape, and then obviously, you know, slowly returning. And we'll explore that a bit more. So hold that thought, Clovis. I've just got some numbers for you, and this is pretty awesome. When you see the globe, you see a picture of the Earth, and it's kind of blue, isn't it? And most of it is ocean. So I have this feeling that there's an awful lot of water. But I can tell you that the globe is 13,000 kilometers across, and from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the atmosphere is 30 kilometers. That's all it is. So the biosphere, the bit that we live in the bottom of the ocean to the top of the atmosphere, is this. You imagine, you know what a basketball looks like, right? So imagine that basketball was planet Earth. And if you looked at it, it would be as smooth as a billiard ball, because Mount Everest is only 2 miles high. So 2 miles divided by 35,000 kilometers is nothing. So it looks smooth. Imagine surround that basketball in clean film, in stretching seal, in that stuff you put over the that's the atmosphere. That's the bottom of the ocean to the top of the atmosphere. So when you think of deep, deep oceans, it's a film of water. It's not a vast body in the way that we might think of it. Relative to us, it is. But the deepest trench in the ocean is what, 3 miles? It's not as much as you think. Anyway, of the water that we have on planet Earth, which quite possibly arrived as a comet, there's a lot of water in space, it turns out, with current investigating it. Did you know the rings of Saturn are ice? Anyway, so of all of the water on the planet, 93.8% at any one time, again, I don't know exactly who worked that out, is in the ocean. So it's not really available to us because it's at the bottom of the hill. If we want to access, we've got to come uphill, which just takes energy. The second is it's stable, so that's no good for growing. There's 1.986, well, probably less than that now because it's melting, but it's caught up in glaciers and permanent snow. So that's 2%. We've already had 94. So 96% of all water is either ocean or glaciers, non-available. 4% is groundwater up to 5 kilometers down. So therefore, you can't reach it. To dig a well, a borehole of 100 meters, costs about £100,000. So groundwater that's actively exchanged is 0.3%. And the bit stuck in lakes, atmosphere, rivers, and biological water, that's you, and everything else, is a tiny fraction of what's available. Of the fresh water is 3% of all water on Earth. Very little is in circulation, most being locked up in long-term storage. 75% of fresh water is ice and glaciers. 13.5% is groundwater that's out of reach at 800 metres and that further. 11% is in the top 800 metres, that's still a long way down. And less than 1% is lakes, fraction of a percent soils, atmospheres and rivers. It's tiny. And this graphic is pretty mind-blowing. So if you took that pool of water and put it into a snowball, compare that to the size of the Earth, that green ball is all of the water on planet Earth. And the light blue is all the fresh water. And obviously that's constantly circulating and through the hydrological cycle. But at any one time, that's the only one, that's all the water that is available to all of us, all life on Earth. That, and as we say in permaculture, water is the ultimate limiting factor. If you don't have water, you have nothing. Bill Mollison said years ago, in the future we'll value land by how much water it has on it, not by how big it is. You can have 1 million hectares, if it doesn't have any water, it has no value, there's nothing you can do with it. That's a very sobering and interesting thought. Let's go back to our slope. We have the top skyline ridges. That's where most of the water falls, is on the top of the hills. That's why you Burnley Down is up there. Now, when we talk about landscape and water, is obviously where we have steep slopes, there is then the danger of erosion. Water has enormous erosion capacity. Water traveling downhill will bring it and move it. So steep slopes, this convex slope, upper slopes, maybe between 12 and 18 degree slope, need to be forested. Should not be trying to farm these areas, or they need to be terraced, managed very carefully. These are the slopes that are most prone to erosion. When we pass the key point, that's the inflection point, where concave turns to convex turns to concave, and then that's where the lower slopes, maybe between 4 and 12 degrees, this is the area which is not very useful for cultivation and for habitation. And most habitation, the first houses would be along that equal line, because that's also, below there is where springs and issues of water come from. So if you look in older villages, you can see the settlements that is up at the slope and below. And the bottomlands obviously can be flooded, can be cold, they can be very fertile, but they can be challenging to work with also. So it's also interesting to think about where they are within the landscape. And the note here on these slow sloping lands, less than 4 degrees, the function of that landscape, according to Bill Morrison, is the revitalization of water, biological storage, and some intercropping. So again, thinking about as we move down through a landscape, that's going to be informed by the degree of slope, the movement of warm air, and the movement of water is going to change those conditions. So here's that same diagram again that we've been looking at. That we've got 84% of atmospheric water is originating from the sea, 16% in this diagram, and we're coming from re-evaporating from the land, which then obviously is returned through rainfall back to the landscape to nourish the landscape. So where we have steeper slopes that are forested, the trees don't just protect the soil from the impact of the rain. Imagine the raindrops hitting the tree, with all of that velocity, because they're coming very high up, they hit the tree and shatter into tiny droplets or into a mist. And the erosive power of the water is greatly removed by the presence of vegetation. You get that? Yeah. Well, again, it would depend on what kind of soils that you've got there. So you might be on your thin, skinny soils. You might have some spring pasture. You might find, if you get a lot of rain up there, that you get an early flush of grasses or something. But it depends on how steep those slopes are. But as soon as it gets slightly steeper, that becomes an essential to have it forestry. Yeah. So we talk about all about swales and water catching and stuff, and usually you wouldn't do that on a slope that's greater than 18 degrees. Well, if you imagine that it's done its journey through the landscape, it's interacting with lots of things, it might have picked up some excess nutrients, it might have slightly eutrophic, or I don't know, it's carrying particulates. So imagine if you then put that into a lake or a pond or a reed bed, and the water can, any sediments can come out of it and be captured, a bit like Ian's pond down the bottom. That's the final exit. The water's done all its work now, so before it leaves the pond, we're going to revitalise that water. We're going to put it into the pond and put the deposited sediments. It's not going to take those on the stream bang. It's going to be aerated by all those lovely reeds and things we've got down there, other marsh plants. And then it can, then it can slowly leave the system. It's being revitalised. Yes, it's done its work. Yes. Yeah. So, some of that water, when it returns, so you're trying to just give this idea that some water is going to seep into the ground and it's going to move a through flow, a surface through flow of water. It's going really quite close to the surface. It might come out in the lower slopes as a spring or an issue of some kind. But some water is going to go really deep down, and it might be locked up for years. You've got long-term deep water storage, and that's a very important thing because that's what's recharging groundwater and wells and things like that. So there's massive problems that are developing in place in semi-arid areas such as the Middle East, where people are using mechanised extraction of groundwater. And obviously, if you start removing water faster than it can be replenished, then it's going to bring the water table down. So it's only actually a very short-term thing to do in boreholes. They're not necessarily, depending on the geology of the place, they're not necessarily very sustainable. So much better is to find ways to intersect the water arriving in the system and hold it high in the system as you can. So here we've got surface storage up on the high slopes where anything that we could do either using trees or interventions to hold water above where the cultivated areas are. That's what we want to do. So ever since the 1940s, really, when we started to industrialise agriculture, we had Plynlimmon Mountain over by Aberystwyth. And on Plynlimmon, you have both the Severn and the Wye, two of the great rivers of Wales or Britain, whatever, lies there on the same mountain. They like to grow sheep there. It's a good sheep area. And to promote pasture, what they've been doing is draining, paying farmers for the last 5 decades to put in drains so that we can hurry water off Plynlimmon Mountain so that we can grow more pasture. Don't speak to anyone who lives in Shrewsbury how that's working out over time. Not well. But I mean, so now when it rains in Wales, water used to perhaps take months and weeks to reach Shrewsbury, Bewdley, Tewkesbury, whatever it is downstream. It's there in hours. Rains in Plynlimmon, next day you can't cross the half of Shrewsbury's closed. And his instinct is to we need to drain it more. We need to accelerate that flow of water even faster, deepen the channel, dredge, excavate. Wrong, completely wrong. The way to stop flooding is to trap and hold the water high in the landscape. Build long-term storages for water, forests, dams, lakes, mulches, peat bogs. So now they're paying the same farmers that they paid to drain their land with Plynlimmon, and now being paid to get the drains up. we've gone through this sort of cycle of thinking, of misunderstanding the nature of what's going on. So the more we speed up any interaction that we do with the system to speed up the passage of water through the landscape, the more by the time you get to these lower slopes, you don't have massive flooding, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's too late. I did enlarge on that. It's a big point. I don't hope it's the same picture again, but with different thoughts to it. I'm going to keep moving.
Just Tabernaki Ali has arrived and he's saying problems with volume. He's saying, can you increase the volume?
Well, I'm sorry, Ali, we've been trying all along, and the only thing we did improve it from yesterday, but it's a bit quiet. So the best thing I can do is just to be reminded to be closer to the microphone. So I hope that's improving a little bit for you. And welcome to Ali. Yeah, great. So here's another sort of transect of a whole water catchment system, and maybe imagine it again on a slightly bigger scale, perhaps. And here's the same thing that we described before: is warm air, very moist air rising off the ocean and forming clouds. The raining winds coming over the land, and then you can see how these clouds are journeying across the landscape. As the clouds raise, they starts raining. So we'll keep everybody on mute unless you specifically want to talk, otherwise we get ambient noises. So don't feel you're being silenced, but you're being silenced. So here's the thing. The water, it's raining down, it's landing on trees, it's landing on soils. Those trees and plants are not transpiring. They're doing the breathing in and out thing, and they return much of that water vapor back to the atmosphere again. You're seeing like little spirals. Look how we've got the wind and the moisture rising and then falling and re-evaporating, then rising again. As you move inland, at this stage is now with our clouds are only 60% of sea level and 40% of re-evaporated water vapors. And as this is a really fascinating thing that I hadn't really realised until we got looked into that. But imagine rainwater lands on the surface of a leaf and then it evaporates back into the air again. It takes with it whatever was on the surface of that leaf. Dust particles, viruses, bits of genetic information. And these things, these little particles then become the nuclei that the next lot of raindrops fall around. So when the second and third generation raindrops are falling, it's rich with information and DNA and minerals that come further down that process. So re-evaporated seawater is one kind of rain. As you move through the landscape, it becomes something slightly different. And that's another very interesting thing to be exploring, is all water is not the same. We'll get into that a bit later on as well. A very interesting guy called Victor Schauberger, who was an Austrian forester back in the 40s and 50s. And he's got a lot of time trying to understand the nature and structure and shape of water. So we'll maybe get into that a bit later. Right. So now look, we're halfway into this landscape, and what he's saying here is by this stage, our cloud cover is only 50% of sea level and 50% re-evaporated rain. Something different going on. And he also says here, if these trees are cut in the foothills of the mountains, then rainfall might decrease by between 50 to 100%. Because as we go further inland, this rainfall, by the time we get to here, it's now 100% re-evaporated water. So if we've broken that cycle, then so human activity and the action of plants is what drives up. Human activity can actually break the hydrological cycle. We create droughts by interfering with these processes. Now I like this next line. There's a little cylinder here. Imagine this bit right in the middle of our system. Let's jump into that and look at that in more detail and see what's going on. And again, I find this fascinating. There's North Wales. This is A5 up to Bangor, and what you're seeing there is evapotranspiration. And it took me a while to realise just how important this is. So it has rained. It's North Wales, it has rained. It stopped raining and the sun came out only minutes before. A lot of that rainfall never even touches the ground. It soaks on the trees and then re-evaporates again. And also, as the tree obviously it's just had a nice drink of water, it's also photosynthesizing, and the byproduct of photosynthesis is O2 and H2O. The trees are giving off vast amounts of water, and they're humidifying the environment. You can actually see that happening. Let's just jump into that section that we were talking about. And the birth of clouds. Water is returned to the air by trees, helping grow clouds. Transpiration, the release of water through the pores of the trees and other plants, accounts for up to half or even more of all moisture returned to the air. Look at this lovely picture here. He's saying 25.6, again, I don't know how he gets so accurate, but 25% of the rainwater over a forest doesn't ever even touch the ground. It just re-evaporates from the leaves again, and then is ready to fall again later. Imagine how that water is energized and formed and shaped by that process. Then it says another 48.5%, I'm going to say 50, is returned by transpiration. So 75% of the rainfall on that forest is returned back to the atmosphere again almost immediately. That's the thing, right? And the next two really important stats you need to kind of hold on to is, okay, so some of that's going to run into groundwater, surface runoff, streams and rivers. That's about a quarter. So it says here, evaporation from forest floor, 0. So what happens when you cut the forest? You completely change that the water cycle is going on, hydrogen cycle within that, and then you start getting in huge amounts of evaporation from the forest floor. Who was it? He was talking about the clear-cut forests up above on the way to Burnley yesterday. He said that. Suddenly that forest floor that's never ever seen the sun is suddenly evaporating with water. You can see that's a calamitous event. And obviously in the evening when it gets cold, the water vapor again forms as condenses and becomes dew. Yeah. So it's often when you wake up in the morning and it hasn't rained, everything's absolutely soaked. Now I hadn't realised that for many, many plants and animals, it's a very, very important source of water, is that condensation. So again, it's an element of which you can think about the earth breathing, exhaling and inhaling, the water going up with the heat and also with the reaction of the plant, and then also it comes down again and recycled. So, yeah, right. So, think about this a little bit, is rainfall interacting with the tree. And rain has an enormous destructive and potentially erosive force. And that force is taken out as it hits the tree. Large drops shatter into fine mist. We're seeing water flowing over the crown of the tree. We've got crown drip around the edges. If you look at most plants, many plants, their leaves are finely balanced. What happens is when the first raindrops come, they're channeled into the centre of the plant. So when the first rainfall comes, it's channeled into the centre of the plant. You might see water flowing down the trunk. It's all like the plant's harvesting it and trapping it and feeding its own roots. As the rain gets heavier and the leaves get wetter, they then start to droop the other way, and then excess water then is shed by the plant and flows off to the edges. So again, it's an element of self-regulation going on, which is also very interesting to observe.
I've got a question, Steve.
Yes.
I was thinking, with everybody we're planting trees all over the place.
Yes.
So how old does the tree be before it sort of gets into this cycle?
It almost starts happening immediately, but it's just happening on a very small scale. It's still doing the same thing. It's the same pattern, but it's just on a video, I'd say. So, yeah. It's saying leaves are 93% water. And then it goes, yeah, when we go down to roots, we start exploring the complexities and relationships between tree and also microbes and organisms. I just help visualize a little bit better about water storage and catchment in the forest floor. This picture is from a community garden in Wales somewhere, where they are in Perrier, where they've harvested lots of old gorse logs, gorse bushes, piled the logs up as brush piles for wildlife, and over the next 2 or 3 years they'll start to rot, and their fungi enjoying that and digesting it. And I was just looking into this sort of brush pile on the floor with fungi going in. I just thought, that's a sponge, that's holding water. That's exactly what we want to do. So the more we can do that kind of thing higher in the landscape, actually more water, then we're creating much more stable flows for streams and rivers. But we don't, so when it rains really heavily, we want the landscape to absorb and hold as much of that as possible, so that what's leaving almost stays constant. There should be a reservoir that will hold, the headwaters of the rivers. Shouldn't be so affected quite directly and immediately by a quick rainfall. And what you really notice living in the Welsh uplands is when it rains, the rivers go up almost immediately, and then they go right down again, because you remove most of the trees from their heavily rain. That's a part of consideration. Okay, I like this picture as well. Jump out in a minute. Okay, so this is a big thing to digest, so I'll just throw this in there. This is probably more leading us towards systems thinking, but this is exploring the interconnections between elements in a system. And we've just been trying to think about how a tree might interact with rainfall, and then how that rainfall then might interact with the soils, and how each one of these elements might interact with each other. So, let's think about this tree here in the middle first. And Bill's encouraging us to think about this tree as a collaborative, not as an individual, as a community. And that within that tree, we have lots of little insects eating away on the tree. And what they're constantly doing is, with their droppings and what have you, is they're returning sugars to the forest floor. They're helping accelerate the nutrient cycle from the canopy of the tree back to the root systems. That nutrient return might be stimulating, all of the other soil biota to develop. Within our tree, then we've got birds, we've got small mammals, we've got numerous different species living together. And between them, like yesterday, I showed you the termite in the tree and how the termite is almost fused with the tree. I think we're exploring that idea about tree being a cooperative of community. And then how this tree is connected to all of the ones around it through the mycorrhizal fungi. There's an increasing realization of this idea, some people call the wood wide web, that the trees are fused together, like through the mycorrhizal fungi, but they can channel water, nutrients, hormones, and antibodies from one tree to another. An ash tree can channel it through a holly tree to another ash tree the other side. They did some experiments by putting marker chemicals to see how they migrated through the forest. And it was a German forest that observed that a significant older tree that had been felled, and its stump was there, was in deep shade, so it could not be photosynthesizing, but 40 years later it was still growing. We managed to prove it because the trees around it were channeling nutrients and sugars to that tree to maintain it, even though it was essentially been felled. So, on another level, we can begin to look at a forest system as a single entity, that it's capturing and processing and recycling all of these incredibly important nutrients, water, carbon, but also all of the other nutrients in the system are being held in there. They're being cycled around by all of these different components. So in a certain way, all of these things are acting as one. Talking about species responding to messengers, species responding to different kinds of conditions, which again helps create that sort of pulse and movement of materials through the system. And then importantly, Bill sat a person there, a student, there sitting on a nice little rock under the tree, and he's also saying this system acts as a teacher. There are lessons to be learned through observation. One of Bill Mollison's quotes that I like is, you could lose all the universities in the world and you've lost nothing. You lose the forests and you've lost everything. Because if we still have the forests, we can relearn. We can rebuild the universities. Yeah. Yes. So, thinking about plants as an interesting idea of guilds, about none of these things are existing in isolation, and even the tree itself is a cooperative or community. So, in terms of capturing and storing energy, which is the context of this, is each one of these elements is conspiring together to capture, store, and cycle those essential components between them. So, if we take the take-home from this diagram, if you think about your garden or landscape or farm or anything else, is you're building an ecosystem. And the function and purpose of the ecosystem is to capture, store, and cycle all of the essential components that are within it. And the more that those things are going round and round and round, the more they're not washing down the hill and going back into the ocean again. We want to keep things in and trap them as long as we possibly can. The tree itself is cooperative, depends on a guild. It's a member of a family of like species, and is involved in the creation of complex molecules, inorganic and organic elements, transform or translator of gases, liquids, and solids. That's what's going on. Very interesting to think about. So I'll jump out of this.
10 plus 1.
10 plus 1, so look back over this. And, okay, so I want to show a couple of little short videos. I've got some stuff to look at. Ooh, we need to go on for another day, or just on this. I like this little video. It's 7 minutes of we're going to watch the water cycle experiment. If you're watching online, you might want to watch it directly off YouTube, or you can see it through Zoom.
There's a lot of water in the world. It's not drifting off into space or leaking down into the center of the earth. It's a closed cycle. So why are we experiencing scarcity in so many places and hearing about peak water and water footprints? The water cycle is too big and too spread out in time for us to grasp it easily. So we'll use this precision apparatus to show how a little piece of it works, to understand why we experience water scarcity as well as flooding. To get to real world conditions, you'll have to add lots of zeros.
We have 8 ounces of water. We have a little cup with holes in the bottom to simulate rainfall. We have containers with spouts made out of 2-liter soda bottles with holes in the bottom to let wet soil drip down. And then we have glasses here to catch the runoff. We'll start with a bucket of dirt, and we're going to fill these containers with dirt up to the level of the spout. We're going to firm the dirt like it is on real ground, and we want these exactly to the level of the spout on both containers, just the same. And on one of these containers, we're going to use a handful of powdered horse manure as a soil covering. This is like dead, weathered plants and stuff, pretty fine stuff. And we're going to firm this up too, just like real plant litter on soil. Now we're ready for the rain. We have covered soil and bare soil. First, we'll try the rain on the bare soil. Here's our simulated rainstorm. Now we'll do it on the covered soil. Same amount of water, 8 ounces, our simulated rainstorm. We have much less runoff off of the covered soil, and it's generally cleaner than from the bare soil. And what we're seeing here is the soil has become saturated, and now it's dripping on through. This is equivalent to groundwater recharge, where the soil is able to absorb and retain enough moisture and allow it to percolate on through to groundwater. This is what causes wells, springs to flow. On the bare soil, there is no groundwater recharge. On the bare ground, there's almost twice as much runoff as from the covered ground. This is the difference over millions of acres between catastrophic flooding and falling water tables with no recharge versus adequate runoff, steadier over time, groundwater recharge, moist soil capable of nourishing plants and crops. The secret to an effective water cycle is covered soil. We can't do that with technology. We have to do it with management. Things like grazing management, controlling the timing of livestock grazing so that there's plenty of ground cover, and keeping in mind that practices such as tillage and burning or fire tend to destroy ground cover and leave ground bare. Now they've been out in the sun for a few hours. The surface of the bare soil is now partially dry, whereas the covered soil retains plenty of moisture. In order to rectify the situation, we typically use technology, pumps, dams, irrigation pipes, things like that, to try to keep the soil moist so it can keep on growing crops. We better use a higher horsepower pump here.
Will this technology solve the real problem? No, but dams and bigger irrigation systems will temporarily relieve the symptoms. The problem is wasted rainfall. On the bare soil, we are not able to capture the rain that falls. Most of it runs off, and little is left to replenish groundwater supplies. In addition, moisture evaporates much faster and more readily from bare soil than from covered soil, so the waste and the scarcity are even worse.
Okay. So it's pretty short, pretty nerdy, but incredibly powerful videos. They just completely dismantled agriculture in one go, just like that. And also to go back to the idea, so the whole strategy is about trapping in holding water as high in the landscape as possible. And so therefore you've got to really think about how you manage the whole system because it's all connected. That's the point I was trying to make really between all those different slides. It's all a continuous process. And if you get it wrong in one bit, it speeds it all up, and then what we do is we just drain the upstream. Yeah. There's a lot of content on this. I've put a lot on the page, and I just want to look at a few things in this slideshow. We have 21 minutes. We have 11 minutes. Okay, so just a few thoughts on this subject again, just to kind of broaden it out a little bit. I've put this slide together very recently. Recent Guardian article, 2017. A third of Earth's soil is acutely degraded due to agriculture. So we just realise soils is this repository for the nutrients of food, for enormous amounts of water, and a third of all the soil in the world is degraded. I think there's another quote Michael Gove when he was Minister of the Environment, which is a strange concept. There's that. We've got 30 years of farming left. The rate at which we deplete in soils, and it takes 1,000 years to build an inch of topsoil, that is a problem. So it just soil building and also water capture turns out to be the sort of life or death importance that we need to be thinking about more. I thought this was a very interesting graphic. This is Britain's population and food supply. That the proportion of our British food that was produced by traditional and organic unmechanized sources in 1750 was 100%. And 250 years ago, we only did organic food. That's really bad. And one of the things I noticed when I'm in Uganda is the food they sell in the restaurants and the food they sell in the market is exactly the same food they're going in the fields around the villages. It's the same stuff, and it's seasonal, and you get what's there. And it's all largely organic, unprocessed. It's really, really good. It's fantastic. And there's almost no processed food. And you really notice that in coming from here, and it's very hard to get anything that isn't processed. So 250 years ago, we started moving into mechanized organic cultivation because we didn't have the petrochemicals. But we did start to have machines and steam-driven things and stuff like that, so we could start doing things like ploughing. In 1800, Britain started importing food. And as we move to that colonial period and imperial period, you can see there was a time by 1950, majority of our food was imported. And it's interesting because you go back to actually go back 1930s. We don't have a lot of data about it. In the late 30s, the Germans overflew Britain a lot and took a lot of aerial photos trying to invade us. That turned out to be one of the most accurate records of British farming, accidentally, or energy. And at a time when Britain was a patchwork of small fields and 2 or 3 million people working in agriculture, we still didn't produce 40% of our own food. It's a really inefficient farming system. Interesting to know. Anyway, but obviously the dramatic change in this is this traditional mechanical organic farming has just about disappeared and has been replaced with chemical farming. So now we're at a stage where 30–40% of our food is imported, and again, it's not imported chemical farm food, or it's chemical farm food. The only good news in this thing is this little wedge down the bottom of traditional organic unmechanized. It's slowly, that's a significant trend. That's what Colin Tudge is saying to us. That's the renaissance in farming. That's real farming, what we call real farming. And I can't remember if I'd said this statistic or not already, but I'll repeat it. Something else that Colin Tudge says very clearly is industrial agriculture has all the flat land, all the pumped water, all the technology, and all the investment. So you would think that the world is mainly being fed by industrial agriculture, and that is not true. It is somewhere between 30 and 35% of all the food is produced that way. That's it. Somewhere between 10 and 15% of food is sourced from nature, like fishing and foraging. Still, there's parts of the world where that's very significant. And 50% of the world's food is produced by subsistence farming, like farmers who eat their own crops. That's still half. So actually, there's still a lot of traditional unmechanized agriculture going on in the world. It just ain't going on here. And a lot of it is in Uganda and places like that. It's one of the reasons why it makes an awful lot of sense to teach permaculture there, because there's a much more ready and empowered audience to apply it to food production. And your point, Claire, about how the hell do we get hold of land in this country is a fair question. This is my critique of monoculture. This is what happens when you plant lots of the same plants at the same time in a field. Those plants all have the same root depth, the same nutrient demand at the same time. So that's exhausting the soil. Those plants are in competition with each other because there's a top few inches is the only thing that's being exploited and explored. So, but again, monocultures tend to need inputs of energy and nutrients because of the competition between the plants. In a natural system, you have a huge range of different plants that would be largely perennial. So at any one time, you've got massive root systems in place, with different patterns, different nutrient demand, different nutrient profiles, happening on different time scales. These plants are not in competition with each other because they're obviously, exploring different parts of different soil profiles. But that's what we need to kind of keep that shape in mind, thinking about how we might, even if we're very interested in annual gardening, and growing lots of veggies and stuff, we need to surround those systems with perennials so that we've got full nutrient cycling and nutrient capture going on. There's one of our Kenyan friends making his compost. Lots of turning, moisture. Compost needs to be moist, not wet. And you need a heap of a certain size if you want to get the sort of the heat reaction going. And if you regularly turn it, you fold air into it. It's what he's trying to tell us. Certainly another energy that captures through energy, these general thoughts about that, is Here is community planting a community food forest in Permaculture a couple of years ago, and there's a real skill and ability in capturing the energy of the community, how to motivate and involve people in growing projects. And it's not easy, but if you get it right, then it's fantastic. And yeah, it's just a banana circle. It's another way of capturing and storing energy, is building a plant hill that can receive heavy seasonal rainfall, soaks into the ground. You fill your pit full of mulch, and then you plant your bananas or whatever it is that you're growing around the edge of that. So you've excavated the pit, so you've doubled the depth of the topsoil on the outside, and you're using the subsoil there as a way to capture the water. And you now provided somewhere to throw all your mulch materials, dead leaves and things. And we've got a lot of these in schools and things, where they can throw all their waste or wastewater from hand washing and things like that, all go into that pit, which then supports the development of that gilded species. I'll introduce you to this gentleman. We'll talk about his work a little bit later on day 4, Yakuba Sawadogo. He's from Burkina Faso, and he has been dubbed the man who stopped the desert. And a wonderful video that goes with this. I love to show it, especially in Africa. You find it very, very inspiring. As a young man, he went to the town and got a job and worked in a motorcycle shop, which is kind of a cool thing to do, and be one of the lads. And he sat there watching, and all he saw was just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people arriving in the town in his footsteps. And he wondered what was happening in the rural areas. So he decided to go back to where he came from, and he found there was enormous distress. The Sahel was rapidly desertifying, part of the world where he comes from. And he thought about traditional techniques that he'd seen as a child and which have ceased to be practiced. And his observation again was that with low, flat lands, compacted soils, long dry season, exactly what we saw in the water cycle video is when it does rain, the water just flows over the surface. It doesn't go in because the top half inch becomes saturated, and then the water can't percolate, and it just flows away. So this is a system called Zyme pits. And all he's doing is going around with his hoe and just making a small indent in the surface of the soil, so that when it rains, the water can't flow off, it sits there. And when the water sits, it slowly percolates in. Now he's found ways to improve on this and to accelerate that process, and I'm going to touch more on that in the system section on day 4. But just capture and store energy. Very, very simple interventions that we can make. What Yakuba discovered is that by putting in Zyme pits and starting off with water catchment, was that he kickstarted succession and the forest came back. And he's created square miles of forest just by going around and doing these little indents with his hoe. Again, it shows that sometimes small interventions can have massive long-term effects. And of course, when you kickstart regeneration in a nutrient-poor environment, the plants that come in are the nitrogen fixers. Because that's their advantage, their superpower. They can go in places where there isn't any nitrogen, and they're not competing with other plants. And then the process, they build the soil, and they kickstart succession. So there's so many things, great things that we can do, and we need to do more. Oops, okay, this is just showing us the difference between a mulched soil and an unmulched soil. But this soil at the top left has been heavily watered, and it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. Where this one's been watered but no mulch, and again it's even hotter. Whereas with the thick mulch, this soil here is at 70. You could cover, we already know that, we've seen that from the water video. Yeah, lots of different dry line technique. I like this picture because it's a sense of, here's our guy doing his survey on the ground. He's understanding the contours, the shape of the land, the topography, and asking himself, or herself, where are the opportunities to capture store water within this landscape? And you can see some excavations, we've got some earthworks, we've got entrapments of water at different layers and different heights within the landscape, all part of an overall kind of water catchment strategy. This is a swale built on contour. You big excavator a trench and build a berm on the downside, then any surface flowing waters is then trapped and will infiltrate into the ground. So it turns out that the real learning of this is the place to store water is in the soil. You don't have to have above ground rainwater tanks, those are really expensive and they constantly fail because of so many things that can go wrong with them. I've seen so many schools in Africa with huge water tank systems and the clutches are all broken. You haven't been maintained. Of course, you need that catchment for drinking water. We'll talk about that later. But for catching water from the landscape, soak it into the soil. It stays, and then once it's soaked into the soil, it moves incredibly slowly. Where surface water can travel very quickly. So just again, understanding the shape of landscape and understanding that for a swale system it needs to be on contour. So the swales are never going to be straight, they're going to be a reflection of the shape of the land. And all you're trying to do is reduce the speed. The things, stop water flowing downhill and let it go sideways. When it goes sideways, it can't erode and it moves slowly so it moves soak into the ground. This is the most extraordinary picture. I can't imagine what that's really. Imagine trying to farm slopes. I mean, it's actually quite lovely. But again, it's illustrating the point of using contour. Making water goes sideways, it can't erode. All it can do is soak in. As soon as it goes downhill, you've got big problems. And about that bit extra. Water tanks. This is just an exploration of how water tends to channel together. So it forms into a river channel with the potential to accelerate. But here in this system, they built a bank across this flow, maybe it's a seasonal flow or something like that. They built a bank across that, and then the water just goes sideways. It deposits water, and then it's there to irrigate the field. Ram pump. We talked about hydro ram pump yesterday when we were down the bottom of the field. Ian mentioned it. And this is a very clever device that can, this is a fast flowing stream. You take some of the flow from that stream and divert it through the ram pump. And 1/10 of the water, so the water that's flowing downhill has kinetic energy, it has motion in it. We can capture that energy to get it to pop a valve to go from one side to the other, and what that valve does is push 10% of the water uphill and then pass it to this clip like that, and water's gone up. And then the valve pops to the side of the clip. So clip, and it can raise the water. Well, we've got some maths here, I don't actually know what they're telling me, but obviously there's a direct relationship between the energy the water will fall and how far up you can push the water. So this is the technology that's been around for well over 100 years, and has one moving part, and is using energy within nature to push water back uphill, so it can do the whole journey again, back through its farming system, back to the stream again. Of the water that's falling down, 90% of it is going to be returned to the river, and we're going to put the energy out of that to push the 10% one click uphill. And then each time, and then once that got, once you fill the pipe, seamless process, it trickles up the top. because of the Dutch, it's more tricky. And but depending on the scale you've done it, then you've got the water back up to the top of the system you can use it again. So you see a lot of places where you've got, especially in Zimbabwe, the high plateau. So the rivers are way down here, the farmlands up here. So the challenge is the water's out of reach. You use some of the energy that's in the water to rise it up again back to the top. The system that Ian described yesterday is slightly different because it's got two different flows of water where you're taking the energy from one flow and using it to push the other, the freshwater up. The dirty is coming down, pushing the freshwater up. This one is taking the same water from the river. Yeah, again, it's called a ram pump. You can Google it, you'll find it. You can make farming bits that you can buy in a farm centre. It's not a complicated thing. Yeah. A tromp is a little bit complicated and there's physics involved, but and I will explain it, but not now. But well, we could just touch on it. So, but it's again, it's a way of capturing and storing energy. If you water has oxygen dissolved in it, and what a tromp is, you let water fall a distance, and as that falls that distance, you encourage it to fold oxygen within it. As it falls down, it then gains in pressure and it pushes out then the oxygen that reaches the bottom because the water's now got energy in it, falling the distance, and then you send it through a valve where you separate the water from the oxygen and you've got compressed air. And you use the flow of water to compress air. And if you've got compressed air, you can drive an engine with that. You can drive power tools with it. It's a very, very interesting thing. So again, there's energy in anything, and you can harness it and use it in all sorts of different ways. Yeah, because it's the fact that the oxygen is, when the water's falling, it readily combines with oxygen. When it comes under pressure, it pushes that out of it. Or the air rather. Yeah. Okay, so there we go. We are at lunchtime. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.
What's the paragraph result?